Okay, as I said, we are in we're going to do over the next 2 weeks, chapters 25 and 26. 26, as most of you remember, is basically a recount of Paul's conversion that he delivers to the king. But Acts 25 is a little bit more detailed with perhaps some new information as Paul defends his ministry, defends himself before Festus, who is the has taken over as the representative from Rome, has taken over from Felix, and we will talk briefly about the differences in those two officials and the way that they dealt with people and with the issues. And then Paul will go before King Agrippa II, his discourse before and the examination by the king in chapter 26. So in chapter 25, we'll at least get through hopefully half of it today, not all of it. There's two defenses that Paul makes in chapter 25. The first, which is a one that's legal and a little bit more formal, is is to the new Roman official Festus, um, who has taken over from Felix, and we're going to find that that Festus has a personality that makes him a very ineffective ruler because he's more interested in the popularity that he gets than he is on whether or not he does the right thing. And it's true that Felix was also that way to some degree, but we find that while Festus will not be quite as ruthless as Felix was, he still nevertheless was probably less of an effective ruler than actually Felix turned out to be. So maybe the question is, perhaps it's better to have a ruthless governor in charge than it is to have a weak, as they call weak-kneed, namby-pamby ruler, because as it turns out, Festus, while he could have very easily undone the misdeed to Paul that was incurred under Felix's rule, he nevertheless doesn't have the backbone to turn him loose when he determines that there's really nothing that the Jews can prove that he's done anything wrong. And he certainly hasn't done anything wrong in terms of how he has fulfilled his duties as a Roman citizen. And so it reminds us very much of the situation that our Lord went through when he was placed before the ruler of the Roman Empire at the time before his crucifixion. So he will speak to Festus in the first 12 verses that we'll go over here in just a minute. The second was before Festus and his guest, King Agrippa, and his sister, the king's sister, Bernice. When we get there, we're going to talk a little bit about just because Agrippa was a king doesn't mean that he necessarily had any more power than Festus did. Because of the way the Roman Empire was set up at that time and the ruling authorities in the various provinces and the cities, we will see that Festus is actually the one who had the greater power. That for the most part, the king at that time was like a vassal king. In other words, he was subservient and he was subordinate to the direct representative of Rome, who Festus is. Festus is really the one that has all the power and the authority. So therefore, King Agrippa could not overrule Festus's ruling, because it would have been very easy if he had greater power than Festus to come in and determine that Paul had done nothing wrong and just turn him loose. But he could not do that because Festus was actually the one who had the superior authority. And we'll talk a little bit about that a little bit later. And really the last few verses or the middle of the chapter is Festus relating to King Agrippa his summary of what has taken place in terms of Paul's defense before him. And while it seems like the last few verses of the chapter that Paul is doing or speaking anything to King Agrippa, it's simply Festus presenting Paul before the king. So his Paul's defense before King Agrippa, and this is King Agrippa II. And we'll talk about historically and the family background related to King Agrippa II. Excuse me. He doesn't actually get into the defense until chapter 26, which we'll take up next week. So let's begin by looking at the first 12 verses, and then we'll go back and pick out the salient things that we need to from those particular verses. Verse 25, and I'm reading from the ESV. Now, 3 days after Festus had arrived in the province, he went up to Jerusalem from Caesarea. And the chief priests and the principal men of the Jews laid out their case against Paul, and they urged him, asking as a favor against Paul that he summon him to Jerusalem. Why? Well, because they had devious plans. Because they were planning an ambush to kill him, meaning Paul, on the way. Festus replied that Paul was being kept at Caesarea and that he himself intended to go there shortly. Remember that Caesarea is the capital city, while Jerusalem was the important city in terms of the religious seat for the Jews. Caesarea was really the provincial capital at the time. So naturally, Festus would be in the capital city. So said he, let the men of authority among you go down with me, and if there is anything wrong about the man, let them bring charges against him. So after he stayed among them not more than 8 or 10 days, he went down to Caesarea. And the next day he took his seat on the tribunal and ordered Paul to be brought. When he had arrived, the Jews who had come down from Jerusalem stood around him. Somehow we have the court settings or the tribunal settings in those days was significantly different than the very pristine situations we have in courts today. It was common practice that the accused stand in the middle and all of those that were charging him kind of surround him, which would, of course, create a very intimidating situation. So they stood around him, bringing many and serious charges against him that they could not prove. Paul argued in his defense, verse 8, neither against the law of the Jews, nor against the temple, nor against Caesar have I committed any offense. But Festus, wishing to do the Jews a favor, said to Paul, do you wish to go up to Jerusalem and there be tried on these charges before me? But Paul said, I am standing before Caesar's tribunal, where I ought to be tried. Why did he say that? He's a Roman citizen, okay? He's a Roman citizen. To the Jews I have done no wrong, as you yourself know very well. If then I am a wrongdoer and have committed anything for which I deserve to die, I do not seek to escape death. We'll talk about what that really means here in a few minutes. But if there is nothing to their charges against me, no one can give me up to them. I appeal to Caesar. So he's making it known right there from the very beginning that he wants his time, as a Roman citizen is entitled to, he's appealing his case straight to Caesar. Then Festus, when he had conferred with his council, and this would be sort of like the Jews have the Sanhedrin, but it's his council of legal advisors and leaders, answered, "To Caesar you have appealed, to Caesar you shall go." They had no choice. When a Roman citizen makes an appeal to Caesar, all other proceedings have to stop. No lower court, so to speak, can do anything when a Roman citizen at that time said, "I want my time before the emperor," which they were all entitled to do. And so his counsel, while they may have, it was really a rhetorical statement that they were making, because they had no choice but to allow him to go on to the emperor. And we'll talk in a minute about the implications that would have had to Festus. So let's go back for just a few minutes, and let's go and talk a little bit about what these first 12 verses mean to us. It has been said that Festus was a better man than Felix, because there was a very strong contrast between the honesty and straightforwardness of Festus with the wickedness of Felix, which we have already studied extensively. However, historians and scholars have also said that Festus was actually a worse governor because he was incompetent. He was naive. He was totally ignorant to the devices that especially the Jewish leaders had and the other people that he came to rule. He was gullible. He was agreeable to a fault. What he was really obsessed with was a desire for popularity. He thought that just being popular was the way to properly rule over his subjects. And it was this greatest fault of his that, of course, resulted in a complete mishandling of a innocent man, the Apostle Paul, just because he wanted to enhance his standing with the Sanhedrin. And so while Felix's initial encounter with Paul and his placing him in prison was certainly incorrect, Festus actually had the power to undo all of that and set Paul loose, but he made the same error as Felix did, in that because of the fear of offending either the people, the Jews especially, who Festus was very much afraid of, as it turns out. Most of the governors were. Why were they so afraid of the Jewish leaders? What had been the history between the Roman Empire and the Jews? Rebellion, okay? All of the leaders, remember, go back to the time of Jesus. What were the rulers at that time concerned about? That the Jews would rebel. That's why they did everything that they could to appease the Jews, even to the point of convicting innocent people, both Christ and now, of course, the Apostle Paul. Charles, you had your hand up? Sure. Which, of course, nobody can do. Nobody can do. Okay? Um, that was his downfall, so to speak, and it led him to make some serious mistakes in the handling of Paul's case, when all along he could have undone the wrong, and even to the point of when he presents Paul's case, so to speak, before Paul comes before the king, um, when he presents the case, he makes the statements that I found him to be innocent. Well, if you found him to be innocent, what's he doing here before the king? Okay? So while he had the time and had the authority to turn him loose, he nevertheless did that. And so Festus, while, as we said, Caesarea was the capital, um, Jerusalem was a very important city in terms of the governors and the leaders of the Roman Empire. So they wanted to do everything they could to keep things under control in Jerusalem. So that's why Festus was very quick to make a trip to Jerusalem. Virgil, you had your hand up. We're in about AD 58 to 50 to 59 probably. Okay, and we'll talk about who the emperor was at that time. But where he was. Actually, the emperor was Nero. Okay, Nero. But we'll also see um, why even with Nero's reputation. Well, here's something that we need to remember, and maybe you've never heard this, but actually the first 5 years of Nero's reign, there was no problems in terms of the Christians. He didn't turn against the Christians until about, and he came to the throne when he was only like 16 years old in AD 54. It wasn't until about AD 64 or slightly before that that Nero did a complete about face in terms of the way that he ruled and the way that he reigned. And it was because of lots of things that were happening, even in his own personal family. His mother was the most responsible for getting him into the kingship, into the emperorship. But then he turned against his mother too, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But it was because of those things that he began using the Christians as fodder in terms of blaming Christians for the ills that were taking place in Rome at the time, and using them in terms of trying to be the scapegoats for all the things that were going on, and even to the point of having them, many of them burned while they were still alive. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Okay? So this is the setting. This is the setting that we have here, and so the pressure that the leaders of the Jews were putting on Festus were powerful enough, because Festus remembers that it was actually the leaders of the Jews that had Felix replaced, and he's well aware of that. That's why he has been able to come in to be the governor. And a lot of these things, while it's not detailed in Luke's account here, you can go back into historical records and you can check, and all those historical records will tell you exactly what was taking place in the Roman Empire at the time, and will tell you very much who was responsible for a lot of these things happening. But Festus would have been very much aware of the fact that these leaders of the Jews, that's probably why he wanted to go down there, very early when he took over, because he's very much aware that they had his predecessor removed. And so the Jews obviously thought, no doubt thought, that they could take advantage of Festus's newness. Let's get him before he has a time to figure things out. And they were very much aware of his propensity and his desire to appease the leadership in all these various cities to keep the commotion down, if nothing else. So they were very much aware of his natural desire to please important groups. Now, Festus, being the naive person that he was, had absolutely no idea of why the Jews really wanted Paul to be brought to Jerusalem. They never intended that he ever make the city of Jerusalem, because they had plotted and they had planned. They had assassins that were ready to take Paul out even on the journey. So he would have never made it to the court. So while Festus should have known what they were really up to, he uh, he succumbed to their request for this favor, and despite the fact that it was based upon a scheme to take out Paul. But Festus seems to accept their request as though it's an honorable request. But it was his own jealousy about his own situation, his own prerogatives, which led him to deny the request. Now, verses 4 and 5. Obviously, obviously, this any such traveling of Paul from Caesarea, where he was in custody, in chains, down to Jerusalem, Paul knew that he was in trouble if that happened. He knew that Festus would never send a guard as extensive enough to keep him from being assassinated at the hands of these uh, Jewish leaders. And so he knew almost certainly that he would have been killed. But Paul was smart enough. Remember, he's a very smart and wise man. He figured out the one protection that he had that Festus could not get around. And that was the fact that not just that he was, a Jew, converted Jew, but still had standing as a Jew. He was a Roman citizen because he was born in the Roman Empire. And so he always had that ace, as they say. He had that ace to protect him. And it was his knowledge of the privileges that he had legally that would help him preserve his life. Now, depending upon how you think of how God cares for you, what might have also been at work in terms of Paul having this ace, so to speak, or being able to say, no, I want to go to Caesar. Who was really taking care of Paul at this time and giving him the means by which to continue his life? God's providential care. Okay? Now, I just leave that up to you, but that's certainly the way I feel about these events, and I hope you do too. Because remember that God had a mission for Paul, and Paul hadn't finished that mission yet. God had a mission for Jesus. And there were many times when the people could have taken Jesus out, could have done him in. But the time was not the time. And so, no doubt that this invisible power or this invisible spirit that is at work from God by which he governs the world provided Paul with an avenue by which he could preserve his life. Any questions or comments through verse 5? Okay, so now let's talk about Paul's defense before Governor Festus. Now, what do you think Festus's reason was for his promptness in allowing Paul to speak to him? Was it because he was such a great governor? Or he felt Paul was entitled to it? What was the real reason? satisfy those Jews. Remember? Festus was going to do everything he could to keep the Jews, the leaders of the Jews, I should say. When I say the Jews, I really mean the leaders. We all know it's the leaders. Okay? It was through the insistence of this conclave of Jewish leaders that Festus was quick to bring Paul before him, this new governor. And so Festus was not some great guy that just wanted to give Paul his day in court. Remember that this group probably is, remember from Acts 25:5, which we read, this would have been the group that would have traveled with Festus, probably the group that traveled with Festus in verse 5. This group would have been headed by the high priest, and that in and of itself would have been an imposing situation. The high priest at this time, by the way, was Ismael, and he had been appointed by Agrippa. Now, the charges that were brought against Paul, Luke does not expand on what the actual charges were. Why would Luke not extend a lot of time here in detailing the charges that were brought against Paul? They were false. Had they been brought earlier? Yeah, back in verse, in chapter 24. Okay? There was some detail there. Whatever the charges were, Luke didn't want to spend any time detailing them because they were all wrong. They were all false. And they could not be proved. Not only did they not prove them, but they could not prove them. There was no way for them to prove them because they simply did not take place. And so Luke didn't spend any unusual time in any kind of an effort to dress up the worthless case against him. And just as they were ineffective before Festus, as they had been before Felix. Verse 8 reveals to us that for all of their cunning, the priests overreached by alleging Paul's sins against Caesar. It was not true, is evident by Festus's apparent willingness to declare Paul innocent of all the charges against Caesar. They were patently false, could not be proved. So really, Festus didn't have any choice in the matter, really, so to speak, but to declare him not guilty in terms of any charges against Caesar. And as we said, the Caesar mentioned here was Nero. Caesar was a common term that was applied to most of the Roman emperors, even though that may not have been their actual. In fact, I'll tell you what Nero's full name was, so to speak. It was Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus. You hear Augustus in there also? That was another common term for the emperors in Rome. And we'll talk more about that later after verse 21. But, of course, Festus, wanting to gain favor with the Jews, who, of course, would have been no match for the deviousness of the Jews, would have, if he had been honest and if he had been true, would have turned Paul loose right then and there. Because the only actual charges that outside of the false charges against Caesar, were related strictly to the Jewish religion. And Festus will later tell King Agrippa that. He says, I didn't find anything wrong with the charges they brought against him. None of them were true and honest. Certainly not of what I expected them to bring before me, he'll say later. The only thing they had was something to do with their own religion. And that was that Paul was claiming that this dead man, as I think the New American Standard puts it, but this man Jesus, who the Jews claim died, but Paul says is alive. So it's this dispute that they have. That's really the only charges that in any way, shape, or form are still have some credibility, if not honest credibility, in terms of what Paul was being charged with. So because Festus would not turn Paul loose, Paul played his trump card, so to speak. He says, okay, he's thinking to himself, just imagine what he's thinking, okay? The only thing that's standing between me and freedom is these trumped up charges that you've already said were not valid against Caesar, is these trumped up charges that have nothing to do with the Roman Empire, only have to do with the religion of Judaism. Of course, Paul being a Christian now, with a Jewish background, Paul's thinking to himself, he says, okay, it's time. It's time for me to play my one ace that they don't know I've got, or they're not remembering that I have. They knew he was a Roman citizen. But Festus, in his naivete, didn't believe that perhaps that anybody would start right out pulling that trump card, so to speak. But Paul did it. Now imagine how this new governor would have felt, Festus. He says, I'm starting out my governorship, and the first thing that happens is some guy appeals to Caesar? I'm supposed to be the one that keeps these things away from Caesar. I'm the one who is the direct representative of Caesar. I'm the one who's supposed to sell. It's sort of like go back to the situation with Moses and all these people in the tribe of Israel, and appointed leaders as he was advised by his father-in-law, appointed leaders to settle these little minor disputes so that he didn't become burdened by all of these. Well, no doubt that was Caesar's desire too. Caesar didn't want to have to sit up there in Rome and then sit there and adjudicate all these things that were going around in this great empire that he had. But one of Paul's statement was, he says, I'm standing here before Caesar's tribunal, has really the meaning of, I've been standing a long time. Now remember, he's standing here and he's been surrounded by all these accusers. And this is not a matter of this, this didn't all take place in 5 minutes. This was no doubt hours that all this was taking place, all this discussion and this dispute. And his statement about, I am standing here, really is what he's really implying is that I've been standing here a long time and I ought to be judged here. Let's get this done. Let's get this over with. But if you're not going to do it, I want to see Caesar. And that's basically what he's saying. I want my time before the emperor. And so what he did was he delivered himself from a incompetent and unjust leader of the tribunal here in Caesarea. And so when Paul says, I want to see Caesar, I want my time before the emperor, the council had no choice but to say, okay, then to Caesar you shall go. And of course, that ended any further discussion that Paul would have had with the tribunal there. Because it was said, once a Roman citizen appealed to the emperor, all other proceedings, legally or civilly, had to be terminated. And all they would do then is take whatever charges they had before them, and they would ship them off with the defendant, so to speak, and send them up to Caesar. And of course, as we said, the emperor at this time was Nero. This is about, as I said earlier, somebody asked the question, this is about in 59 AD. And it was about the end of the quiet period, so to speak, of Nero's reign as the emperor. He will shift from a young adolescent. Isn't it amazing that a lot of these these teenagers had such a significant role back in those days? Bernice, when King Agrippa shows up, Bernice, his sister, is only 16 years old herself. She had 2 marriages. So when King Agrippa came into the rule, or Nero, I'm sorry, he was very young, about 16 years old, and for the first, as we said, the first 5 or 6 years, there wasn't a lot of discrimination or a lot of things that was anti-Christianity. But there was historians say that it was the death of his mother that set him off in terms of him doing a completely about face. And it's interesting because he had his mother killed. His mother was responsible. Nero's mother was responsible for getting him into the kingship. Very briefly, and then we'll close. I'll tell you about the background of Nero, and then we'll carry that with us next week. Nero was 16 years old. His mother worked with others to have his Claudius and Caligula and everybody else wiped off the earth, so that her son could take over as the emperor. Nero, keep saying Nero, okay, was the way you spell it. For the first several years, or first 5 or 6 years, was okay, even though he knew his mother was really the power behind his reign. And there was things that began to take place with his mother becoming more active in trying to exercise the power in influencing her son to do this and to do that. He said, well, he attempted himself several times to kill her. He eventually had one of his soldiers actually killed her. And then he sobbed and he cried over her body, declaring how much he loved her. And there's also indications that he even had an incestuous relationship with his mother. So it was a very corrupt, immoral situation that he was ruling in. But when his mother was killed, Nero went, as they say, high and to the right in terms of his behavior and his activity. He became very ruthless, persecuting Christians, even having them killed as scapegoats for every little thing that took place. There was a great fire that took place in Rome during his reign. Many of the Roman citizens blamed him for it, thought that he had started it to burn off a large portion of Rome because he had this great big mansion, so to speak, this big palace that he wanted to build. So it was a very corrupt, very tumultuous situation that came later. But right now, at this time, Nero is not the ruthless, despicable, even though he was immoral already, having also had affairs at the age of, as a teenager with different women. Um, he was not as ruthless and anti-Christian, at least at this point. So Paul would not necessarily have any problem going to see the emperor. If it had been maybe 6 years later, Paul would have said, oh, no, I'm not going to him because I know what's going to happen up there. Okay? So that's the historical setting that we're in. We'll pick it up next week, finishing out chapter 25, and then chapter 26, there's not a lot of discussion because it's really Paul retelling his conversion story, which is very important, but nevertheless, we're well aware of what that took place. So thank you all. Appreciate it, and we'll be back.